Daria Top and Daria Dress Sewing tutorial. I'm so excited to finally be getting out a new sewing pattern for you guys, and this one is one of my favorites. I mean, I know I say that about everything that I release, but I genuinely love everything that I make. The Daria Top and Dress I both released in 2022 after I released the April Top and Dress. I had a lot of people at the markets who absolutely loved the April Top and the April Dress, but they had larger busts and they just wanted to have the option to wear a bra with it. So I kind of wanted to find a little bit of a middle ground, something that had a closed back that was still adjustable and really beautiful, and I think that the Daria's was the answer to that. They've been an absolute staple for me in my wardrobe. I've released them in so many different colors. I've had them in a beautiful like green gingham. I've done black, I've done white gingham, and I'm hoping to release some more color options very soon for them both. But of course, I do want to give you guys the option to make your very own. I've been having a lot of requests to release the Darias and I'm finally doing it. If you're someone who wants a little bit of coverage, wants the option to wear a bra but you still want that adjustability, maybe your body fluctuates quite a bit, I feel like this top is just perfect for you. So this is the top. I'll obviously also put photos and everything up on the screen, and then the dress is pretty much the exact same, just you have an extra tier here. So as you can see at the front, you have this little gathering situation happening, and then you have all of this nice and flowy in the midsection here. You also have the closed back detailing, so you are able to wear a bra with this top. You can wear it a little bit looser or you can wear it nice and tight. I typically say to stick to your regular sizing with these tops or size down. If you have a smaller cup size, I am normally a medium with tops and dresses, so I'm wearing a medium. It is a little bit giving in the cup here because I don't have boobs, so I technically could size down to a size small if I wanted to, but I think this just gives a lot of room in my hips and my waist because I have size large hips. But definitely stick to your regular size or size down if you have a small cup size or if you're between sizes and you're a bit unsure. I have listed this as a beginner friendly to intermediate top. It's definitely really easy to sew. The difficult part is obviously the curve along here, and then the bias. You have bias in the arms here, and then you also have the bias in here as like the casing. That's not really good at showing you. Just there, so that's like your casing and everything. So that's probably like the most difficult bit, and then the shoulders. So if you've never done bias before, then maybe give that a little bit of a practice, but other than that I feel like that's pretty much the only difficult part. To adjust it, all you have to do is just adjust by pulling on this bust strap here, and then you just move the gathers up as you like. It's kind of hard to do with one hand, but I'll insert a video up here hopefully so that you guys can see what you're doing, and then there's videos throughout this that will show you. But it's a really beautiful top. I love making these. I love wearing this, especially during the summertime, and I'm so excited to finally share the Darias with you. The first part of the tutorial will be for the top, and then the second part will be how to sew the dress, because there is like a slight difference with that one, and all the timestamps will be linked down below. I will also say that in the tutorial I go over how to sew the top section for the top, and it's the exact same for the dress. The part that goes different is this part, because obviously for the dress it's connected here, so that's like the only part that's different. So for the first portion of this video, if you want to watch that, and then I leave a little timestamp for where to skip to when you want to start sewing the dress, just because I go over it a little bit better in the top portion of the video. There's also a few other links down below for the bias tape as well as the sewing pattern itself. So if you want to learn how to make bias tape in a continuous strip, I've left the link down below for a video that I made on how to make some. Otherwise, everything else is in your instructions booklet, and I think we should start making the top now.
We're going to make the Daria top first. If you're making the dress, please watch until this timestamp on the screen to see how to make the top portion of the dress with the main panel pieces before skipping forward to this timestamp for the rest of the dress. Both the top and the dress pattern is the exact same except for the back waist panel and the added skirt for the dress. You'll need to cut out your paper patterns, and each piece will have a note to say if it's needed for both pieces or just for the top or just the dress. I'm using a medium weighted linen fabric for the top, but you can also use another light or medium weighted woven fabric. Cut out your patterns by following the pattern cutting guides on the pieces, and remember to mark your notches. For this garment, you'll also need to make bias tape. The amounts needed are listed in your instructions booklet, and I've also linked an Instagram tutorial for how to make the continuous bias strip out of a matching fabric, linked in the description below. You can also purchase pre-made bias tape or cut out strips of your fabric diagonally and use this. Okay, let's begin. Start by taking the main front pieces and place the good sides together and pin along the straight edge of the front of the top. If you are using two different coloured fabrics, just make sure you have a left and a right side. Now take the main back piece and the back neck facing piece and place the good sides facing and pin along that top curved edge. Next, sew a straight stitch along where we've just pinned with a 1 cm seam allowance.
Something's not right.
You can then overlock those raw edges, and if you don't have an overlocker, you can also do a zigzag stitch or an overcasting stitch to secure the raw edges. We'll also overlock that bottom curve of the back neck facing piece to secure those raw edges. While we're here, we're going to overlock that center front part of the front waist panel. Next, we'll give everything an iron so it sits nice and flat. Press all the seams to one side on the front main pieces and then flip it to the right way over with the wrong sides facing to then press the seam flat. And then do the exact same with the opposite side and that back main piece as well. This is optional, but I find that it helps to keep the inner fabric from coming out when wearing the top. We'll sew a top stitch along the overlocked edges of the seam from one end to the other, sewing it to the inner fabric. Make sure when you're sewing the front main pieces, you are sewing the top stitch on either side so that you still have a left and a right piece for the top. And we'll also do the exact same for the back neck facing by sewing a top stitch from either end on that overlocked edge, sewing onto the back neck facing. this is what it should look like. Again, you don't have to do this, but it does just help to keep the pieces in place a little bit better. Now take your front main pieces and place them down so you have a left and a right side with the good sides facing up. Then place your back main piece with the good side facing the front and align the shoulders. Align the seams and pin along the edges on either side. Your back necklining piece will be a little shorter than the front main piece, as this just prevents it from sticking out of the top when we wear it. Once pinned in place, you can then sew a straight stitch along this edge to create your shoulder seams. Then go ahead and overlock or zigzag stitch those raw edges. Iron the shoulder seams flat by pressing them to the back of the top. Then fold your piece the right way out and press the neckline seam flat, and then repeat for the other side. This is also optional, but it does help to hold the shoulder seam in place for later on when we're sewing the bias. We'll sew a straight stitch in the seam of the shoulder starting from the neckline to the shoulder edge using the stitch in the ditch method. Do this for both sides. If you're making the dress, you can now skip forward to this timestamp on the screen. If you're making the top, you can just keep watching. We're now going to work on the waist panels. Take the front waist panels and we're going to hem the center front pieces on either side with a 1 cm hem. Remember to flip over each side so that you have one for your left and your right side, and if you want to, you can also give this a press with your iron beforehand to help with sewing. Now we're going to gather these pieces. Change your stitch length to the longest setting and then sew a straight stitch from one end to the other with about a 2 cm seam allowance from the edge. You'll also need to remember to not back tack on either side because we'll need to be pulling these together. You can also do a second gathering stitch if you like, but I just typically do one because I hate removing the threads. Pull on the thread to gather up your fabric and then take the front main piece of the top and align the curved edge of the top to the gathered edge of the waist piece with the good sides facing. Pin along this edge and then spread the gathers around evenly. You will also be pinning that inner fabric as if it's a part of the front piece. If you find that it moves around a bit while you're pinning, you can also just sew a basting stitch to hold the bottom curve of the main front pieces together. Make sure the center front of the waist panels are in line with the center front of the main front pieces. Do this for both sides and make sure your gathers are evenly spread along, and then we can sew a straight stitch with a 1 cm seam allowance from one end to the other. Once you've sewn both sides, you can then remove the gathering stitches by pulling on the threads. We'll then do the exact same for the back waist piece. Sew a gathering stitch along the longest straight edge and gather this piece by pulling the threads. Place the back main piece down with the good side facing the good side of the back waist piece and pin along the longest edge, spreading the gathers evenly as you go. Now sew a straight stitch along this pinned edge with a 1cm seam allowance. Also make sure you are catching all the gathers and the raw edges don't poke out from the good side. If they do, you might have to just unpick and sew over it again. Once you're done, just pull the gathering stitch out by pulling on the threads or use a seam ripper to help remove any threads that are stuck. Then you can overlock or zigzag stitch the raw edge of the back piece where we just sewed. On the front piece where the waist piece joins to the curve, you might have a little bit of an overhang. You can just cut that excess fabric off if you'd like. Now we're going to take our bias tape and at the shorter edge, we'll fold this over by 1cm to the inside and sew a straight stitch to hem it. Lay the front of the top down like this with just the raw edges of the seam up and the good sides of the waist piece and main piece facing. And we're going to align the bias tape to the seam starting at the center front with the good side of the bias tape facing the wrong side of the waist panel seam and having that folded hem that we've just sewn on the bias tape at the center front. Pin in place and continue to pin along this curved edge. If you're using a continuous bias tape like I am or have excess, just cut that off at the side. Make sure you're pinning from the waist panel side, not from the main front side, because we want to make sure that the casing folds over onto the front main side to create that casing for the bust strap. Once you've done one side, you can repeat for the other side. Now we can sew a straight stitch along this curve starting from one end to the other with a 1cm seam allowance.
So that's
And this is what it should look like. Once you've sewn both sides, I would recommend to either zigzag stitch or overlock these raw edges, as this is going to be where the casing for our strap will go through, so you want to avoid those threads from fraying. Remember to also overlock the other edge of the bias tape that we haven't sewn yet, and you can also do all of this before you sew the bias tape to the main piece and the gathered piece if you don't want to be sewing over so many layers. If you've overlocked your edges, you can secure the tail end of your threads by taking a larger needle and threading it through the overlocks. Then take the tail end through the end of the needle and then just pull it through the overlocks to secure the tail end between. Just repeat this for the pieces on the center front where the opening is. This is another optional part. I know I keep saying that throughout this piece, but you don't really have to do it, but it does just help to keep the seam down. Move the main front panel and the waist panel pieces to the side so you just have the bias tape and that seam together, and align the seam flat with the inside of the bias. You can either hand stitch or sew a couple of stitches, just a few centimeters on that seam to the bias to help hold it in place and out of the way. This just helps to stop it from sticking out or from those threads from coming out when we move the bust strap through it. Now we'll create the casing by folding over the other side of the bias and pinning it to the good side of the inner fabric. Continue to fold over and pin in place the bias. You may also need to maneuver it around the curve as you go, and remember to also check on the good side of your top that the fabric hasn't bubbled up, as you want to make sure that this sits nice and flat. Once you've done one side, just repeat for the other side.
Something's not right.
Now we can sew a straight stitch from one end to the other, sewing close to the edge of the bias, leaving about a 1.5 centimeter gap from the other edge to create that casing. Repeat for both sides, and then this is what it should look like. Next we can sew our bust straps, and you can do this two different ways. I'll show you one way in the top version and a different way in the dress version. I typically will overlock along the edge, but you can also just sew a straight stitch, which is what I'm going to do here. Fold the strap in half lengthways and then sew a straight stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance from one end to the other. Repeat for both of the straps, and then once you've sewn them, take a loop turner or a safety pin and turn your straps inside out and then press them with an iron. Now take the safety pin and thread it through the bust strap, and then you can thread the bust strap through the casing using the safety pin. Leave about 1 to 2 centimeters of fabric at the end, and then we'll sew a straight stitch just going over the casing to secure the bust strap in place. You can then cut off any excess that is sticking out. Once that's done, flip the front piece over so the good sides of the front are facing the good sides of the back, and align the sides. Pin along the sides and make sure the center seam where the waist pieces join the main pieces are aligned. Pin down both sides and then sew a straight stitch to join the front to the back. Then overlock or zigzag stitch those raw edges, and while we're here we can also go ahead and overlock the bottom edge to prepare for hemming. If you'd like, you can iron your bottom edge over to prepare for hemming by folding it up by 1 centimeter and pressing it all the way along. Otherwise, you can just do it like I have done here and just fold it up 1 centimeter as you go and sew your hem. I like to press the side seams flat with my iron, and I push them all to the back side just so they sit nice and flat and look nice and crisp. You can also press flat your gathers along the waist panel too, so it just makes them all sit nice. Finally, we'll finish up with the armholes by taking our bias tape and folding over that shorter edge to the inside and then aligning the fold with the seam of the armhole with the good sides facing. Pin in place and then continue to pin in place around the armhole, making sure you're catching both the layers of the front main piece. When you get back to the starting point, overlap the bias tape by a couple of centimeters and cut off the excess. Then repeat this for the other side. Now sew a straight stitch along that edge with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I like to remove that casing on my sewing machine and just have that arm piece sticking out so that the armhole can kind of go under and around as you sew. Once you get back to the start of your stitch, overlap it by a couple of centimeters, back tack, and then this is what it should look like. And then just repeat for the other side. To help this sit a little nicer, cut the raw edge of the seam down by about 0.5 centimeters, so your seam allowance will now be 0.5 centimeters. Then we're going to flip our bias tape over. You can have it so that the bias tape is completely on the inside and not exposed, but I did design it so that the bias tape is exposed. This is also really fun if you want to do a different colored bias tape. Starting from the side seam, fold that first fold down flat, and if there's a bit of excess fabric here, you can cut it off. So fold that first fold down and then fold the bias tape over again so that the crease of the fold is basically in line with where the seam is on the opposite side. You'll want it to be in line or slightly over this seam so that when we're using the stitched in the ditch method, we're catching the bias on the inside. Continue to fold over and pin along the armhole, and if you need to adjust anywhere, it's best to do it now before you sew so that you don't have to unpick anything. Once you've done pinning, this is what it should look like. We'll then be sewing in the seam using the stitch in the ditch method. Again, have your machine's casing removed and place the top's armhole through it, as this can help when sewing this part. Start at one end in the seam and sew a straight stitch in the seam all around the armhole until you get back to the start, overlapping by just a couple of centimeters. It should look like this when you've finished, and now you can repeat the exact same method for the other side. Before we finish, if you find that the neckline facing flips up a bit when you're wearing the top, you can sew a straight stitch a couple of centimeters along that overlocked edge of the neckline facing and the back main piece. Or you can also just add your own tag here like I have. Lastly, for the bust straps at the end of them, simply tie a knot in them close to the very edge and cut off the excess. And then once you're done, here is your Daria top. Now we're going to start making the Daria dress. You'll need to cut out your patterns by following the cutting guides. The only pattern piece that is different from the top is that back waist panel, so make sure you use the dress one as well as cutting out the skirt panel. I'm using this pink gingham linen fabric for the dress, and I was just a little bit short on the fabric, so I ended up using some leftover cotton broadcloth for the inner fabric of that main front panel piece. You can keep yours the same as your main fabric, or if you want to, you can use a different one for the inner piece like I have. I'm going to quickly go over making the top part of the main front and back pieces, but this is the exact same as the top, which you can see exactly how to do it in more detail from this timestamp here. First, pin the front main pieces together along that center front edge with the inner and outer fabrics good sides facing. Remember to have a left and right side, so flip one to the opposite side, and then sew a straight stitch down this edge. Take the back main panel and the back neck facing and align with the good sides facing and pin in place, then sew a straight stitch along that curve. Then overlock where we've just sewn, as well as overlocking the other curved edge of the back neckline facing. Next, you can sew your top stitches on those overlocked seams to hold in place on the back neckline facing and the inner fabric of the front main piece. Here's what that should look like. Now we'll attach the shoulders of the main pieces together, so align the top shoulder of the back main piece with the shoulder of the front main pieces and pin in place. Remember to align that center seam, and just note that the back neck facing will also be slightly shorter to prevent it from poking out. Then you can sew a straight stitch along the shoulder seam, followed by overlooking those shoulder seams or zigzag stitching. Going to iron, press those seams towards the back panel and then fold over and iron down the neckline to sit nice and flat. And then you just need to sew a stitch in the seam of the shoulder using the stitch in the ditch method to help hold the fabric in place. Okay, now we're caught up. That was just a quick run through of everything. If you want to watch the full tutorial on how to do the front piece in detail, please go back to the top portion of this video. But now we can move on to the waist piece. This is sewn a little bit differently from the top version as we're joining the two sides together. Firstly, you'll need to overlock or zigzag stitch that center front of the front waist panels. Then place them good sides facing with the center fronts aligned and pin in place where the notch is at the center front, and then down to the bottom. We're going to sew from the bottom up until we get to the notch and then back tack a couple of times. We're also sewing with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. This is what it should look like. This just creates an opening for you at the front. If you find that this gap is a little bit too big or too small, feel free to change it. Now we'll press open our seams to either side so that we can hem them. Next, you can just sew a straight stitch on either side to create your hem. Here's what it will look like once you've finished, and now we can go and gather the waist panels. Change your stitch length to the longest length and then take the waist panels and along the top edges sew a gathering stitch. Remember not to back tack at either end so that we can pull these threads. Do this for both the front waist panel pieces and the back waist piece. Now you can pull the threads to gather up the fabric. Then you can attach the front main pieces to the front waist panel by placing them together with the good sides facing, aligning the center front of the waist panel to the center of the front main panel and pin from the waist panel along the curved edge of the front. Move the gathers around as you go and then just repeat for the opposite side. You can then sew a straight stitch from one end to the other. Remember to set your stitch length back to normal now and back tack at the start and finish. Now you can pull on the loose gather threads and remove them. If they break when removing them, you'll just need to use a seam ripper to pick them out. We'll do the same method for the back. Take the back main piece and align the good side with the good side of the back waist panel piece. Pin along the edge and move the gathers around as evenly as you can. Then sew a straight stitch along this edge to secure the gathers to the main back piece. And once you've finished that, you can go ahead and remove the gathering thread. If you have this excess fabric hanging off at the center front piece, you can cut that off as well if you'd like. Now we'll just go ahead and overlock the raw edge of that back main panel piece with the gathers. If you don't have an overlocker, you can just do a zigzag stitch or an overcasting stitch on your sewing machine. While we're here, we can also overlock our bust straps. This is typically what I do, but you can also sew a straight stitch like what we did for the top earlier. Just fold your strap in half lengthways and sew a straight stitch or overlock down the longest edge with a 1 cm seam allowance, and then repeat for the other strap, and then we'll come back to this later. We'll do the casing now for the bust strap. First, flip your dress over and have the good sides of the front main piece facing the good sides of the front waist piece. Now take your bias tape and fold over that shorter edge to the inside and sew a straight stitch to hem it. With the good sides of the bias tape facing the wrong side of the front waist panel, align and pin the bias along the curve and gathered edge from the center front to the side. Cut off any excess of the bias tape and then just repeat for the other side. Now sew a straight stitch from one end to the other with a 1 cm seam allowance. You can then overlock or zigzag stitch along where we've just sewn, as well as the opposite side of the bias that we haven't sewn yet. You can also overlock and zigzag stitch beforehand if your machine can't go over so many layers. With those tail ends of the overlocking thread, you can secure them by taking a larger needle and threading it through the overlock. Then take the overlock tail through the needle and then pull the needle through until the tail comes through the overlocks. This just keeps it all secure. This is optional, but I think it helps to keep the overlocked seam from poking out of the bust strap casing. Take the bias tape and the seam that joins all the pieces together to one side and push that seam onto the bias tape. Now you can sew a couple of centimeters or hand stitch along that overlocked seam onto the inside of the bias tape to help secure it down. This just prevents any threads from coming loose when you adjust the top. Cut any loose threads off, and then this is what it should look like. Now we'll create the casing by folding over the other side of the bias and pinning it to the good side of the inner fabric. Continue to fold over and pin in place the bias. You may also need to maneuver it around the curve as you go, and remember to check on the good side that your fabric isn't bubbled up or anything. You want to make sure that it just sits nice and flat. Once you've finished one side, just repeat for the other side. Now we can sew a straight stitch from one end to the other, sewing as close to the edge of the bias, leaving about a 1.5 centimeter gap from the other edge to create that casing. Repeat for both sides, and then this is what it should look like. Going back to our straps, we'll flip them inside out with a loop turner or a safety pin and then press with our iron. Now take the safety pin through one end of the bust strap and take the bust strap through the casing, leaving about a 1 to 2 centimeter of the end of the bust strap out the other side. We'll then sew a straight stitch just going over that casing to secure the bust strap in place. Then just repeat it for the other side. You can cut off the excess that was sticking out too, and then at the end of your straps you can just tie a knot in them and cut off the excess fabric. Now we'll flip over the front piece, so the good sides of the front piece are facing the good sides of the back piece, and align the sides. Pin along the sides and make sure that the center seam where the waist pieces join with the main pieces are aligned, and then pin down both sides and then sew a straight stitch to join the back to the front. Repeat for both sides, and then you can go ahead and overlock both of those side seams. And here's what the top will look like. Now we're going to work on the skirt panel. So set that aside and take your skirt panel pieces. You'll have a front and a back. Place the front and back skirt pieces together with the good sides facing and pin along the shorter edges on either side. Then sew a straight stitch on either side to create your side seams. And then you can overlock or zigzag stitch those side seams. With your iron, you can press your side seams on the top part of the dress to one side, as well as the side seams of the skirt to one side. And then I also like to press my gathers too, so that they all sit nice and flat and that the seams all go to one side of the dress. Next, we'll go back to the sewing machine and we'll sew a gathering stitch along that top edge of the skirt panel by changing your stitch length to the longest length and sewing along that top edge. Remember to not back tack on either end so that you can pull the threads. You can also sew 2 lines of gathering stitches if you like, as this is quite a lot of fabric to gather up. Then you can gather your fabric by pulling on those threads. And now we're going to attach the top to the skirt. Take the top and the skirt and push the bottom edge of the top through the skirt with the good sides facing. Line up the side seams of the skirt panel with the side seams of the top panel and pin in place. Then you can go around the waist panel and pin the skirt panel to it, moving the gathers around as you go. Next, sew a straight stitch all around this edge to join the top of the skirt panel to the waist panel on the top piece, and then sew with a 1 cm seam allowance. Once you've done that, you can pull out the gathering stitches by pulling on the threads, and if you get any of them stuck, you can just use a seam ripper to pick them out. Once you've done that, you can overlock your raw edges to secure them together, as well as overlocking that bottom edge to prepare for hemming. If you've overlocked and you have that tail end of the overlocking thread sticking out, you can take a large needle and thread it through the overlocks, and then put that tail end through the needle and then pull the needle through the overlocks to secure the thread. Give your dress a press with the iron over all the gathers to lay them flat, and I like to push the seams all to one side as well so that it all looks nice from the inside and sits nice and flat. Then you can iron your hem if you'd like to by folding up the bottom edge by 1 centimeter and pressing it with your iron all the way around. Go back to your sewing machine and you can sew your hem by sewing a straight stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance all along that bottom. We're almost finished. Next, we'll finish up the armholes by taking out bias tape and folding over the shorter edge to the inside. And then align the fold with the seam of the armhole with the good sides facing. Pin in place, then continue to pin in place around the armhole, making sure you're catching both the layers of that front main piece as well as the bias tape. When you get back to the starting point, overlap the bias tape by a couple of centimeters and then cut off the excess. Then you just have to repeat for the other side. Now sew a straight stitch along the edge with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Once you get back to the start of your stitch, overlap it by a couple of centimeters, back tack it, and then all you have to do is repeat for the other side. To help this sit nicer, cut back the raw edge of the seam down by about 0.5 centimeters, so your seam allowance will now be 0.5 centimeters instead of 1 centimeter. And now we're going to flip our bias tape over. Starting from the side seam, fold that first fold down flat, and if there is a little bit of excess fabric here, you can cut it off if you need. So fold that first fold down and then fold the bias tape over again onto itself so that you have that crease of the fold and it's basically in line with where the seam is on the opposite side. You'll want it to be in line or slightly over this seam so that when we sew using the stitch in the ditch method, we are catching the bias on the inside. Continue to fold and pin along the armhole, and if you need to adjust anywhere, it's best to do it now before you sew so that you don't have to unpick later. Once you've done pinning, repeat for the other side. Once you're finished, this is what it should look like. We'll be sewing in the seam using the stitch in the ditch method. Start at one end in the seam and sew a straight stitch in the seam all around the armhole until you get back to the start, and then overlap by a couple of centimeters. And then just repeat for the other side. Once you're done, give your dress a press with the iron and then you're finished.
The sewing tutorial. I can't wait to see you guys make your very own Daria top or dress or both, and if you do, please be sure to tag me on Instagram at sewing_in_May or on TikTok at @inmay_the_label, and I can't wait to see you guys create your very own Darias. If you also have any questions, please feel free to reach out or comment down below and I'll try to get back to you. And don't forget to check out any of my other sewing patterns, especially if you've enjoyed this, and if you did enjoy it, please leave a review because it really helps me out. If you enjoyed making these pieces and you want to try some other sewing patterns, I'll leave a link down below for my other sewing patterns. And yeah, I just can't wait to see you guys create your own Daria. Thank you so much for watching.